let's start with the CBO numbers and the drum roll, please, Tori. What did the CBO find?
Well, I'm going to make you wait a second and just want to explain something really quickly. The federal government works on a slightly different calendar than you and I would. So for you and I, a calendar year runs January through December, but for the federal government, the fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. So we're already looking at preliminary estimates for the closeout numbers for fiscal year 2022. And according to the Congressional Budget Office and their preliminary estimate, the deficit for the fiscal year that just ended on September 30th, fiscal 22, the deficit was $1.4 trillion. So there's good news and bad news there. The good news is it's half the size it was last year. Last year's deficit was $2.8 trillion. The bad news is that it's still too doggone high. And we still got a lot of work to do on getting our fiscal house in order.
There are a couple of anomalies in that number. I mean, the 1.4 trillion is affected in a couple of ways that you pointed out on the blog. Mm-hmm. What are the anomalies that go into that number?
Well, obviously, a deficit is a mathematical relationship between two numbers, right? It's the difference between how much we spend and how much we generate in revenues. And there were some weird things going on both sides there. On the spending side, we spent a lot less than we did last year. The federal government spent about 8% less than last year. But it's not because any kind of fiscal restraint suddenly, morphed over Congress and they decided to be more fiscally responsible. It's not like they took proactive actions to cut spending. What they did is they just didn't renew emergency COVID relief. So it's literally Congress did nothing and the deficit fell. On the revenue side, a couple of things happening there. Obviously, the economy recovered from the COVID pandemic a lot faster than anyone expected. So tax revenues were up big, 21% over last year. Part of that was economic growth, but part of it also was deferred taxes. If you recall, some of the COVID emergency relief legislation that was passed in 2020 and 2021 allowed businesses and some individuals to defer their tax liability, meaning they could pay it later. And so those due dates were in fiscal year 2022, which is why we saw revenues up as big as they were. Part of it was economic growth. Part of it was that people got to defer their taxes.
So it's great deficit reduction for politicians because they didn't have to do anything, and
right.
and the deficit came down. And I think, as you pointed out in the blog, it's still high. I mean, we forget because it just spiked so ridiculously during the last 2 years because of the pandemic and the economic fallout from that. So just getting back to a quote unquote normal is it's a normal that is not normal. It's
right. I mean, I would like to point out to people who are listening, $1.4 trillion deficit is not normal. It's not normal on a dollar basis, but it's also not normal in terms of, like a percentage of GDP, which is one of the ways that, economists and budget people, we like to compare budget data from year to year because of the effects of inflation and a growing economy. We always look at budget statistics as a percentage of GDP. And the long-term average over the last 50 years of our deficit relative to GDP was 3.5%. And last year's, preliminary numbers from CBO show that the deficit is about 5.5% of GDP, a full 2 percentage points higher. And clearly, that level of deficit spending is not sustainable. So, yay, the deficit is half what it was last year, but it's still too damn high.